So that's a bit of a trench of information, and I don't want people to get overwhelmed or confused. What I'm trying to do here is paint a picture of the biology of water, understanding that when you ingest water, drinking it down, or when you breathe water vapors in the steam room or on a humid day, that water is entering your system. It's accessing your cells through these two mechanisms: diffusion across cell membranes or movement through aquaporin channels. And then once inside those cells, it's able to interact with and change the conformation of different proteins and accelerate or slow down different cellular reactions. Everything from normal metabolism to blood pressure to damaged cells, depending on a number of different features of that water, as well as what the cells happen to be doing at any given moment. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn our attention to how water, depending on its temperature, its pH, how much we drink or how little we drink, when we drink that water, etc., how that can impact the health, disease, and repair of different cells, tissues, and organs of our body. I'd like to just take a brief moment and thank one of our podcast sponsors, which is Inside Tracker. Inside Tracker is a personalized nutrition platform that analyzes data from your blood and DNA to help you better understand your body and help you reach your health goals. I've long been a believer in getting regular blood work done for the simple reason that blood work is the only way that you can monitor the markers such as hormone markers, lipids, metabolic factors, etc., that impact your immediate and long-term health. One major challenge with blood work, however, is that most of the time, it does not come back with any information about what to do in order to move the values for hormones, metabolic factors, lipids, etc., into the ranges that you want. With Inside Tracker, changing those values becomes very straightforward because it has a personalized dashboard that you can use to address the nutrition-based, behavior-based, supplement-based approaches that you can use in order to move those values into the ranges that are optimal for you, your vitality, and your longevity. Inside Tracker now includes a measurement of apolipoprotein B, so-called ApoB, in their ultimate plan. ApoB is a key marker of cardiovascular health, and therefore there's extreme value to knowing your ApoB levels. If you'd like to try Inside Tracker, you can go to insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 20% off any of Inside Tracker's plans. Again, that's insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 20% off. Let's talk about how much water, or more generally speaking, how much fluid each and all of us should drink each day, and how much fluid to drink depending on our specific activities and environment. Now, this is perhaps the most commonly asked question when the topic of water comes up. How much water do I need to drink? The other thing that comes up is a question, which is, can't we just follow our natural thirst? That is, can't we just pay attention to when we're thirsty and then drink fluids? And then that leads to the other question, which is, does the color of our urine provide any indication as to whether or not we are underhydrated, overhydrated, or hydrating correctly? So let me answer each of these things one at a time. And in the backdrop, I want to highlight the fact that there are many, if not dozens, hundreds of studies pointing to the fact that when we are dehydrated, our brain doesn't function as well and our body doesn't function as well. So what I'm attempting to do in that statement is throw a net around the enormous number of studies that have shown that even a slight state of dehydration, even 2% dehydration, can lead to a significant and meaningful impact, that is a negative impact on our ability to, for instance, carry out endurance type behaviors. So our ability to run on a treadmill and stop at the point where we feel like we can't continue is going to be negatively impacted. That is, we will be able to perform less work for less period of time when we are even slightly dehydrated. Likewise, our strength is reduced by even slight dehydration. Likewise, our cognitive performance, including memory, focus, creative thinking, flexible thinking of different kinds, are all significantly impaired when we are in states of dehydration. Now that raises an additional question that deserves attention, which is, how do we actually measure dehydration? Now you hear different things, like if you pinch the skin on the top of your hand and it takes more than 3 seconds to lay down again flat, then you're dehydrated. You hear that. You hear, okay, if you are to press on your fingernail and see a change in the color of the tissue just below your fingernail, which indeed does happen, and it does not go back to its original color within 1 to 3 seconds, then you're dehydrated. You hear things like this. If your ankles are swollen when you're wearing socks, you take off the socks and you can see the imprint of the socks on your lower limbs, that means you're dehydrated. You hear this kind of stuff, and you should probably be wondering, is any of that true? To some extent, it is true. although it can vary quite a bit by how old you are, whether or not the skin on the top of your hand tends to be looser or not, depending on whether or not you're leaner or not. So in other words, those are not absolutely objective measures of dehydration. Now, it is true that if normally you can pinch the skin on the top of your hand and it returns to its normal flattened position within about 1 to 2 or 3 seconds, and it does not do that within 5 or more seconds, there's a decent probability that you're a little bit dehydrated, that you need to ingest some fluid. Or that if you press down on your nail and you see the depression causes a transition from kind of a pink color to a white color, and then you release and it doesn't go back to its original pinkish color within a few seconds, well, then there's a chance that you're dehydrated. But again, these are not perfect measures of dehydration. You may be surprised to learn, and I was surprised to learn, that most of the basis for these statements, like even a 2% dehydration state can lead to significant reductions in cognitive or physical performance, are based on not direct measures of hydration, but rather on measures of reductions in water intake, which is a different thing, right? It's saying that ordinarily a person of a given body weight needs X amount of fluid per day, and when they get even just 2% less than that amount of fluid, then their cognitive and or physical performance is impaired, rather than focusing on dehydration of tissues. Okay? Now, that might seem like a subtle distinction, but it's actually a meaningful distinction when you think about it. However, it's a meaningful distinction that we can leverage toward understanding how much water or fluid we need to drink each day. Now, there we can really point to some solid numbers that, believe it or not, are fairly independent of body weight. Now, I say independent of body weight, I'm referring to the amount of fluid that most healthy adults need at rest. What do I mean by at rest? I mean when not exercising and when not in extremely hot environments. So I'm leaving aside you desert ultramarathoners or people that are doing any kind of movement or living in environments that are very, very hot. Here I'm mainly referring to people that live most of their daily life in indoor environments. Could be air conditioned or not air conditioned, heated or not heated. What we're trying to arrive at here are some numbers that can work across the board because, of course, there are an infinite number of different conditions that each and all of you are existing in. So I'm not going to attempt to give you a body weight by activity, by environment, by humidity formula calculation. In fact, no such calculation exists. However, there are formulas that can put you into very stable frameworks. That is, levels of water intake for periods of rest when you're not exercising and for when you are exercising that will ensure that you are hydrating, with the one exception being if you are exercising or if you are living in very, very hot conditions and you're not heat adapted to those conditions. So what are those numbers? In other words, what is the answer to the question of how much fluid do we need each day? And here I'm referring to fluid. I'm not distinguishing between water, caffeinated beverages, soda, tea, and so on. I'll discuss that in a moment. We can reasonably say that for every hour that you are awake, in the first 10 hours of your day, this is important, in the first 10 hours of your day, you should consume, on average, 8 ounces of fluid. Now, for those of you that are using the metric system, not ounces, 8 ounces of fluid is approximately 236 milliliters of water. And for those of you that exist in the metric system and aren't used to thinking about ounces, and vice versa, just think about a typical can of soda in the United States is 12 ounces. In Europe, sometimes the cans of soda are a little bit smaller. That's a whole discussion unto itself. But 8 ounces of fluid, that is 236, let's just say 240 milliliters, because we don't need to be too precise here, of fluid on average every hour for the first 10 hours of your day, which translates to an average of 80 ounces of fluid for the first 10 hours of your day, or 2,360 milliliters of water. In other words, approximately 2 liters of water plus a little bit more for the first 10 hours of your day. Now, I want to be very clear that this does not mean that you need to ingest 8 ounces or 236 milliliters of fluid on the hour, every hour for the first 10 hours of your day. I'm certainly not saying that. And in fact, most people are going to find that they're going to ingest water in boluses. That is, they're going to have perhaps 16 ounces of water 500 milliliters of water at one portion of the day, and then maybe a couple hours of later that they'll drink some more water or some more coffee or soda or some other beverage in another portion of the day. I do think, however, it's important for most of us to take a step back and ask ourselves whether or not, independent of any other activity or environmental conditions, whether or not we are, in fact, ingesting 80 ounces or basically 2.4 liters of water for that 10 hours of the day that spans from the time we wake up until 10 hours later. Now, why am I setting this 10-hour framework? The reason I'm setting this 10-hour framework is that it turns out that your fluid requirements, even just at rest, are vastly different in the time from when you wake up until about 10 hours later as compared to the later evening and nighttime. And here I'm referring to people that are not doing night shifts. But if you are requesting a number of how much fluid to drink, independent of our needs for fluid for exercise, that's going to be 8 ounces of fluid or 240 milliliters of fluid on average for every hour from the time we wake up until 10 hours later. That's the simple formulation that should basically ensure that you're getting sufficient baseline hydration for the cells and tissues of your body. Now, if you are engaging in exercise, whether or not it's endurance exercise or whether or not it's resistance training exercise, you are going to need additional fluids in order to maximize the effects of that exercise and to avoid dehydration. And there too, we have some excellent numbers that we can look to. Excellent because they arrive from research. And this is largely peeled from the episode that I did with Dr. Andy Galpin, professor of kinesiology at Cal State Fullerton. We did a 6-episode series all about exercise, everything from strength training, hypertrophy, endurance, nutrition, supplementation, recovery, everything related to exercise. You can find all of that at hubermanlab.com. And one of the components of those episodes that was discussed, but that some of you may have not heard, is that there is a simple formula for how much fluid to ingest on average. Keep in mind this is on average when you're exercising. And I refer to this as the so-called Galpin equation. The Galpin equation states that you should take your body weight in pounds, divide that by 30, and that will give you the number of ounces of fluid to ingest every 15 to 20 minutes on average while exercising. Okay? Your body weight in pounds divided by 30 equals the number of ounces of fluid to consume on average every 15 to 20 minutes. When I say on average, what I mean is it is not the case that you need to stop every 15 or 20 minutes and consume that volume of fluid. You could sip it from moment to moment. You could wait half an hour or an hour and then consume a larger bolus of fluid, a larger amount. Although it is recommended for performance sake that you sip or consume beverages fairly consistently throughout your training. One's ability to do that is going to depend on a number of things like gastric emptying time, whether or not the particular exercise you're doing, whether or not it's running or jumping, is compatible with ingesting fluid on a regular basis, or whether or not you need to do it at different intervals than every 15, 20 minutes. Maybe it's every 5 minutes, maybe it's every half hour. You have to adjust for you. But if you were to take the hour of exercise or the half hour of exercise or the 3 hours of exercise and ask how much fluid to ingest, it's going to be that Galpin equation of body weight in pounds divided by 30 equals the number of ounces for every 15 or 20 minutes. And of course, I can already hear screaming from the back, what about for those of us who follow the metric system? And there's a simple translation of the Galpin equation, which is that you need approximately 2 milliliters of water per kilogram of body weight every 15 to 20 minutes. Again, the Galpin equation converted into the metric system is going to be 2 milliliters of water per kilogram of body weight every 15 to 20 minutes on average. I'm sure a number of you are asking whether or not hydration prior to exercise is also important. It absolutely is. And if you follow the numbers that I talked about before, approximately 8 ounces or 240 milliliters of fluid intake per hour in the first 10 hours of waking, that should establish a good baseline of hydration heading into exercise, which then prompts the next question I often get, which is the amount of water that needs to be consumed according to the Galpin equation during exercise on top of or separate from, that is, does it replace the amount of fluid that one needs at a basic level, that 8 ounces or 240 milliliters? And there, the answer sort of goes both ways. I think if you're going to exercise, then obviously follow the Galpin equation in some way. Again, you don't need to be ultra specific about this. These are ballpark figures that will ensure hydration. So we've set them a little bit higher perhaps than needed to ensure more hydration rather than less. But basically, the short answer is if you're exercising for about an hour, most people are exercising for an hour or two, probably not more than that. Most of my workouts are, certainly the resistance training workouts, last about an hour. Well, then you can replace the 8 ounces or the 240 milliliters of water that's required at baseline with what you consume according to the Galpin equation during that bout of exercise. A common question is if you are exercising in a heated environment, indoor or outdoor, or you are somebody who tends to sweat a lot. And by the way, we can all get better at sweating by sweating more. Sweat is an adaptation. So if you sit in the sauna more, you're going to get better at sweating. If you exercise more, especially if you wear more layers or if you do it in hotter temperatures or more humid temperatures, you're going to get better at sweating over time. And sweating is an adaptation that helps cool your body. If you are sweating a lot or you're in heat, how much fluid should you ingest? In general, I think it's safe to say that you may want to increase the values on the Galpin equation by about 50 to 100%. So either increase by 50% or double those numbers if you're in a very hot environment or sweating an awful lot. If you are sitting in the sauna, I highly recommend consuming at least 8 ounces and probably more like 16 ounces of fluid. So that translates again to about 240 or about 480. Let's just round up 500 milliliters of fluid for every 20 to 30 minutes that you are in a hot sauna. And then, of course, people ask, well, how hot? And that starts getting really detailed, and we can't distinguish between dry saunas and wet saunas. And again, too many variables. But I would double your fluid intake for that hot environment exercise or for that hot environment sauna sit. Also, if you are feeling dehydrated, what does feeling dehydrated mean? That actually has a definition that we can get into a little bit later, but what we're really talking about here is if you are feeling as if your throat is dry, you are quote-unquote parched, or you're very thirsty, well, then there's absolutely no problem with ingesting more fluid, so 16 ounces of fluid or 500 milliliters of fluid per hour while you're feeling parched. My read of the literature is that thirst is a reasonable guide for when we tend to be dehydrated. However, it is the case that our thirst doesn't really keep up with our body's level of dehydration. And we know that based on some really nice studies that have explored the amount of fluid intake compared to the amount of urination, compared to the amount of physical output, compared to the environment that one happens to be in. These are sort of older studies in the realm of physiology, but here's the basic rule of thumb that's going to work for most people. If you are feeling parched, consume fluids. Ideally, you consume fluids that don't contain caffeine or other diuretics. Diuretics being substances that cause the release, the urination of fluid from the body. And or if you are consuming caffeine either prior to or after bouts of exercise or even just at work, or you work in an air-conditioned or otherwise dry, cool, or hot environment, that you try and include some sodium, and ideally sodium, potassium, magnesium, the electrolytes in that beverage. So it could be a little pinch of sea salt with some lemon to adjust the taste a little bit. It could be an electrolyte drink, an element or some other sort. There are a lot of different types out there. For most people drinking pure water, and I realize that many people do just like the taste of pure water, chances are you're going to have enough electrolytes unless you're sweating quite a bit or you're exercising quite a lot. And under conditions where you're consuming very few carbohydrates, you're going to excrete more fluid. If you are ingesting caffeine, whether or not it's from tea or coffee, I highly recommend increasing your non-caffeine fluid intake about 2 to 1 for every volume of caffeine. So in other words, if you have 6 ounces or 8 ounces of coffee, you're going to want 12 to 16 ounces of fluid, ideally fluid with electrolytes or a little pinch of salt, in order to offset that dehydration. Hopefully those will provide good rules of thumb for what people want to do when they're just moving about their day. Again, underscored by the fact that even slight levels of dehydration can really impair our cognitive and physical performance, largely by creating fatigue, but more often than not by creating brain fog. I get so many questions about brain fog. Why do I have brain fog? Why do I have brain fog? There is a vast literature showing that quality hydration, meaning hydration that matches the demands of humidity and output, as described in the equations that we went over a little bit before, really can enhance clarity of focus and overall energy. And we'll talk about why that is, but I'll just allude to it a little bit here. The reason why ingesting sufficient fluids can enhance our ability to focus and in fact can reduce brain fog and can increase physical vigor and output is not mysterious to us. We know that there are 2 mechanisms by which fluid intake triggers elevated levels of alertness. And it all has to do with the so-called sympathetic arm of the autonomic nervous system, which is a real mouthful. But basically the sympathetic arm of the autonomic nervous system, as many of you heard me talk about before, is the aspect of your nervous system that makes you more alert. It has nothing to do with emotional sympathy. It has to do with a bunch of neurons in the middle of your spinal cord called the sympathetic chain ganglia and some other related neural networks in your body, as well as regions of your brain like the locus coeruleus that release things like epinephrine and norepinephrine and make you more alert. And in a kind of magnificent arrangement, or I think magnificent arrangement, when we have fluid in our gut and when our cells are well hydrated, and believe it or not, when our bladder contains fluid within it, there is an elevation in activity of the sympathetic nervous system by way of two pathways. One is mechanical. In fact, we have so-called stretch receptors in our bladder and in our gut. These stretch receptors have fancy names like TRP, trip channels as they're called, or piezo, which are these stretch sensing channels. This is the beautiful work of many laboratories, but in particular, David Julius and Ardem Petapuchin. David Julius is at UC San Francisco. Ardem is at the Scripps Institute. They've discovered a bunch of channels in cells that sense things from cold to different mechanical pressure, including expansion of tissues, so-called mechanosensation. And basically what it all boils down to is that when our bladder has some fluid in it, when our stomach has some fluid in it, and when our cells are sufficiently hydrated, they send information about the mechanical presence of that distension. And here I'm not talking about being like overly full, full chock-a-block full of fluid, or your bladder feeling really, really full. We'll talk about that in a moment. But when we are sufficiently hydrated, there's a mechanical signature of that, which is the expansion of our tissues because it has more fluid in it. And there are chemical signals as well, which is the movement of water across those aquaporin channels is actually understood at a biological level by our cells and sends information to the areas of the brain that are associated with so-called sympathetic arousal and makes us more alert. This is actually what wakes us up in the middle of the night. If we have consumed too much fluid prior to sleep and we need to urinate, we wake up. This is a mechanism that is not adequately developed in babies and young children. This is why young children often will wet their bed. And believe it or not, in both humans and in dogs, our ability to control urination voluntarily is something that we actually learn. Babies just pee in their diaper. Dogs just pee on the floor until they're housebroken or until a child learns to hold on to their urine until they go to the bathroom in a bathroom or particularly appropriate location, outdoors or otherwise. The point is that hydration of the body is signaled to the brain. When we have enough fluid in the tissues of our body, when we consumed enough fluid, even if it hasn't already arrived to the cells and tissues of our body, that is signaled to the brain in the form of alertness. And that alertness is what translates to the enhanced cognitive abilities that we have when we are well hydrated. It's also what translates to our enhanced physical abilities when we are challenged with physical tasks. So when you look out on the landscape of all these studies that have shown impairments in physical or cognitive performance under conditions of even slight dehydration, that all makes sense because our cells need fluid and we need water, but it also prompts the question of, well, does being well hydrated actually make our brain and body function better in the context of physical and cognitive performance? And indeed, the answer is yes. Now, earlier we were talking about these equations that you can apply. And here again, I really want to emphasize that these equations were not meant to be followed down to the decimal point. They were really meant and are meant as crude but sufficient guides for you to make sure that you're getting enough hydration, depending on your levels of activity and at rest. If you recall, when we talked about those equations, I said you need about 8 ounces or 240 milliliters of fluid per hour for the first 10 hours of your day after waking. Now, why did I say for the first 10 hours? Well, it turns out that the filtration of fluids from your body, which is accomplished, of course, by your kidneys and by way of your bladder and the excretion of fluid out your urethra, so-called urination, is strongly, strongly circadian dependent, meaning the cells of your kidney and the cells even of your gut, in fact, all the cells of your body, but especially the cells of your kidney, which filter the fluid that comes into your body and that make certain hormones like vasopressin, which is anti-diuretic hormone. All of that functioning of the kidney is under strong regulation by so-called circadian clock genes. Circadian clock genes are genes that are expressed in every cell, but that in certain cells of the body very strongly impact whether or not that organ, in this case the kidney, is going to be activated, meaning functioning, at a very high level or at a reduced level. And we can make all of this very simple by simply stating what's contained in this beautiful review that I'll provide a link to if you want to learn more, called Circadian Rhythms in the Kidney. And basically what is known is that for the first 10 hours after waking, your kidney is filtering fluid within your body at a very rapid rate. There are a number of different cell types that do that, but they are basically taking that fluid, pulling out any contaminants, using hormones such as antidiuretic hormone, vasopressin, to adjust whether or not you're going to hold on to fluid or release more fluid from your body in the form of urine, depending on the salt concentration, depending on how much fluid you need, your work output, the conditions you're in, all of that. However, at about 10 hours after waking, your kidney really starts to reduce its overall level of functioning. Now, that doesn't mean that your kidney cannot filter fluid 11 or 12 or 16 hours after waking, but it becomes far less efficient at doing so. And thank goodness it does, because you do not want your kidney filtering fluid at the same rate at midnight, assuming you wake up at, say, 7 or 8 or 9 a.m., that it was filtering fluid at 10 a.m. In fact, we can say that if you want to reduce your nighttime waking in order to urinate, which is a common question and concern that many people have. How can I avoid waking up in the middle of the night to urinate? And there I say, it's perfectly normal to wake up once, maybe twice each night to urinate. But if you want to reduce the number of times that you wake up in order to urinate across the night, maybe even make that number 0 times, you will greatly benefit by doing 3 things. First of all, make sure that you're hydrating sufficiently during the daytime, per the equations that we talked about earlier. That will ensure that you are not excessively thirsty in the evening and therefore consuming a lot more fluid. Second, and related to that first point, is that you do want to reduce your fluid intake at night, provided you hydrated sufficiently throughout the day. And believe it or not, the rate at which fluid moves from your gut and into the cells and tissues of your body, and then from your bladder into urine, is determined not just by the volume of fluid you ingest, but also the rate at which you ingest that fluid. Now, you might be thinking, that's crazy. That makes no sense at all, right? If I drink a ton of fluid slowly, doesn't it still mean that I'm going to urinate a ton? Yes and no. It also stands to reason that you might ask, if I ingest very little fluid, but I do it very fast, is it going to be the case that I'm going to urinate it out very quickly? Well, yes and no. The point is that the fluid filtration systems of your body that range from the gut to the bladder and include the kidney, of course, depend not just on the volume, but on the rate of fluid that you ingest because of those mechanosensors that we talked about earlier. If you gulp down a bunch of fluids, you are going to excrete those fluids more quickly than if you sip them slowly. Sip them slowly. So here's what I recommend. Throughout the day, when you're trying to get your adequate yield of water or other beverages, feel free to gulp that fluid or sip it. I'm a gulper, not a sipper, but many of you are going to be sippers, not gulpers. Consume fluid at the rate that feels right to you, but feel comfortable gulping that fluid. However, in the evening, if you are somebody who has challenges with waking up excessively in the middle of the night, reduce your fluid intake, provided you've hydrated properly throughout the day. And I suggest consuming no more than 5, maybe 8 ounces of fluid between the time of 10 hours after waking and when you go to sleep. Again, if you're very thirsty or you underhydrated or it's very hot, feel free to ingest more fluid, please. But most people will find that if they reduce their fluid intake to about 5 ounces or less of fluid in that later part of the day, after 10 hours of having woken up and before sleep, and they sip those beverages as opposed to gulping them, that they will have fewer bouts of waking up in the middle of the night to go to the restroom, and ideally 0. Let's talk about tap water. And here I have to take a deep breath, not a deep gulp, but a deep breath, because in researching tap water and what's contained in tap water in different regions, not just in the US, but around the world, I confess the picture is a pretty scary one. I want to be clear, I'm not somebody who naturally orients towards fear or conspiracy theories. However, in researching tap water for this episode, by way of looking at the peer-reviewed research, meta-analyses, reviews, specific research articles, where specific hypotheses were tested. And in talking with experts in toxicology and so on, it's a pretty grim picture, frankly, when one looks at what's contained in most tap water and whether or not the compounds that are contained in tap water are present in sufficient concentrations to negatively impact our health. And the bad news is that much, if not all tap water, believe it or not, much, if not all tap water contains things that are bad for the biology of our cells. There is a silver lining, however, and the silver lining is that very simple steps that are very inexpensive can be used to adjust that tap water to make it not just safe to drink, but that makes it perfectly fine to drink. So that's the good news, and we'll get to that in a moment. If you are somebody who is interested in whether or not tap water contains things like endocrine disruptors, hormone disruptors that can negatively impact reproductive health in males or females or both, there's a wonderful review, wonderful because it's so thorough, although the news isn't great, it's very thorough, which is great, which is entitled Endocrine Disruptors in Water and Their Effects on the Reproductive System. This is a review from 2020 that analyzes water from a bunch of different sources within the world and essentially focuses on a few key components. First of all, it focuses on the concentration of minerals, that is magnesium and calcium within water. Many people don't realize this, but so-called hard water, sounds terrible, right? But hard water is water that contains magnesium and calcium, which turns out to be a good thing. Some water contains more magnesium and calcium. Other water contains less. They looked at the presence of magnesium and calcium because that is going to impact the pH of water. In general, the higher concentrations of magnesium and calcium in water, the higher the pH. That is, the more alkaline that water is, and the lower levels of magnesium and calcium, the more acidic or lower pH that water tends to be. The other thing that this review addresses is the concentration of so-called DBPs, dog, bulldog, porcupines, DBPs, which are disinfection byproducts contained in water. So obviously local governments, the government, wants your drinking water to be clean. They don't want contaminants in it. They don't want sewage in that water. They don't want chemical contaminants that are going to make people immediately sick. So they treat water treatment plants treat water with disinfection products, and those disinfection products create things called disinfection byproducts. And the presence of those DBPs, or disinfectant byproducts, can strongly impact the pH of water by way of changing the concentrations of magnesium and calcium. Put differently, I do believe that governments are trying to provide people with clean water, but in doing so, oftentimes will introduce things to that water that are not good for us. Now, it's very clear that DBPs can cause endocrine disruption in ways that are not good for reproductive health. I did a very long, in fact, 4.5-hour episode on fertility and vitality. That was male and female fertility, by the way, and vitality. That, again, you can find at hubermanlab.com, that talks about all the biological processes involved in the generation of healthy eggs and sperm and creating healthy embryos, implantation of embryos, and so forth. It's very clear that DBPs have been shown to disrupt ovarian function, spermatogenesis, and fertility outcomes, even at concentrations of DBPs that are present in drinking water that comes from the tap. Now, does that mean that you shouldn't drink tap water? Well, the answer to that is it depends. What does it depend on? Well, it depends on several things. First of all, I highly recommend that everybody go online and put in your zip code and ask for a water analysis of water that comes out of the tap in that zip code. This is something that is readily available online, at least to my knowledge, and unfortunately, there's no specific one site that I can send everyone to get an in-depth analysis of the drinking water that comes out of your tap. However, I highly recommend that you go online and put in your zip code or municipal area code and figure out whether or not your water contains X amount of DBPs or Y amount of DBPs. Now, of course, you're going to get a bunch of values back, and unless you're a toxicologist, probably not going to know what those values mean. But what you're really looking for is whether or not there are high, low, or moderate levels of fluoride in that drinking water. Why do I say that? Well, there are studies that show that the concentration of fluoride in drinking water is of particular concern for the thyroid hormone system of the body. Now, thyroid hormone has a lot of different roles in brain and body, And thyroid hormone is very important for everything from metabolism to levels of energy. When thyroid levels are disrupted or if thyroid receptors are disrupted, it can lead to depression. When thyroid hormones are optimized, it can lead to optimal mood, if there is such a thing. But in other words, it helps keep your mood elevated. It relates to everything from sleep to reproduction. Thyroid hormone is involved in many, many things, including bone health and tissue health generally. So essentially every biological process in your body is impacted by thyroid hormone. And there's a study that I'd like to highlight, which was published in 2018, and the title of the study is Impact of Drinking Water Fluoride on Human Thyroid Hormones. This was a case control study, so this is not an extensive analysis of many individuals. However, what it shows is that fluoride negatively impacts thyroid-stimulating hormone and so-called T3 levels. So you have thyroid hormone T3 and T4. Even in